Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome you to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. This conversation today is packed with super ideas. Some are theoretical and many are practical. In fact, we realized that there was so much rich material in this conversation that we decided to divide it into 2 episodes. This episode, therefore, is entitled, How Churches Can Build Healthy Relationships with Mission Workers, Part 1. Our guest for today's episode is Matthew Phillip, who serves as the Director of Global Outreach at Trinity Church in Lansing, Michigan. Matthew has been involved with missions for some time now, including his service some years ago as the Associate Director for Urbana in 2003 and 2006. Matthew, I was at Urbana 2006. Does it bring back happy memories to think that Urbana is coming up again this year?
Yes, it does. Urbana definitely has been a point of service where there has been a lot of joy. So absolutely excited to see an Urbana every 3 years.
That's good. Matthew and Anita, together with their family, now live in Lansing, Michigan. Matthew, we appreciate you spending this time with us today. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. It's a delight to be with you.
We are looking forward to unpacking some lessons that Matthew has learned over these years. But just before we get to that, Matthew, would you just tell us a little bit about your current role at Trinity Church?
Absolutely. I serve here at Trinity Church as the Director for Global Outreach. And my role mandates me, encourages me to raise the missions quotient of the church. Paradoxically, I have learned over the last few years that my focus is more pivoted and turned towards the people in my church as I equip them to engage with missions, engage with our partners, and engage with our global friends.
That's one thing that I recall from past conversations with you, how some pastors have pastors of mission or something like that, some title like that perhaps, where they really carry out the work on behalf of the church, whereas I saw you, Matthew, deploying much of the activity that a pastor of missions might ordinarily do to the congregants, to the body of Christ. It was a fascinating element that I expect will emerge in our conversation today. We've organized this around some lessons that Matthew has learned and is willing to share with us. If you are serving in a local church, perhaps you're a pastor or in a missions committee, or perhaps a congregant in a church that would like to participate helpfully and fruitfully in global missions, we hope these lessons will be helpful for you. Matthew, let's jump right in. What's the first lesson you'd like to share?
A recent lesson that we learned has been about the health of the missionary. Now, almost all missions committees are committed passionately to making sure that their missionary is doing well. But often the metrics of evaluation, we just go with how are they doing physically, how is their financial situation, and how are they doing. We have a general how are you. We have found out recently we need a little bit more attention on the question of spiritual vitality. How are they doing in their walk with the Lord? What is their spirituality looking like? Is that at a healthy place?
Mm-hmm. Were there particular clues that you observed that brightened this in your awareness?
As the good Lord usually operates, he shines the light on us first. And there was a season in the last 3 to 4 years where that light shone on the missions committee here at Trinity, and where we experienced greater joy and greater sense of vitality in our spiritual walks, not just alone, but as a community. And as we started to share that with our missionaries and our strategic partners around the world, we felt we had hit a nerve. There was such reception to that sort of an engagement that we said, this is a place where we really need to invest in serving our missionaries in helping them in their spirituality.
What are some of the practical elements of this when you think about a sending church engaging with the spiritual journey of a mission worker?
I think some of the practical touch points or examples would be ensure that we are consistent in our care of the whole person of the missionary, not just at the selection point, which is usually here on the North American continent, but also as we support and care for them. Include this dimension in the communication, in the interaction. Be specific. Have a bunch of questions that kind of open up the possibility of interaction here.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a particular rhythm or time frame for asking those questions? And in what forum are you posing some of those questions?
We usually do so when we are face-to-face with a missionary or a strategic partner. We do so as we encourage our advocacy teams, which we may talk about that a little later in the conversation, to include that in their conversations with the missionary. And we just want it to be part of the rhythm of our conversations. What is Jesus saying to you? What are you learning from Scripture? What is the Lord directing you to engage in? Questions that make this truly an issue of Missio Dei, in which He is the one leading us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is just as I think serving in an agency, it brings me to ask the question whether there may be deficiencies in how our teams are functioning. But I would, again, just affirm the beauty of the sending body participating in that ongoing journey. How have you found the reaction of your workers? Have they generally been appreciative?
They have been very appreciative because they recognize there is no performance metric that is part of the conversation. They recognize when we care for them and share resources and events, specifically wait and listen, that we are really concerned about who they are and their walk with the Lord. We've also discovered the authenticity of the communication increases when we are willing to be vulnerable about our own journeys of transformation. And as all of us know, there are ups and downs in transformation, or rather points of obedience and disobedience. And as we open up those conversations, we've just found it to be very, very healthy in building the relational bond.
You mentioned in passing how there's an evaluation, consideration that takes place when a worker applies for service at the front end, if I could say it that way, the evaluation process. But really, you're seeing this not just as a preliminary step. This is an ongoing process, right?
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the assumptions where we made, a false assumption we made 10 years ago that, okay, once they're okay, they're always okay. Mm-hmm. And truly the care from a church is in this arena. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a partnership. While we kind of trust the mission agency for the financial, the retirement, the accountability, the direction on the field, this is a niche which I do believe allows for a really nice trilateral partnership in making sure that we float the boat on the evidence or on the situation of being spiritually vital.
Agreed, yeah. In another part of our conversation, you have used an analogy of a garden. Before a worker departs for the field, it may be that they're part of a very rich spiritual community. Mm-hmm. Talk just a little bit about your analogy of the garden.
Visually, a worker usually is in a large garden with other healthy plants. There's watered well with a weekly great message, with community, with sharing, with accountability. And suddenly, usually, we transplant them into very dry areas. We put our workers in places where we know the gospel has to expand. They are not necessarily areas of ease. They're critical front lines. And part of the struggle of our missionary workers has been the isolation, the lack of community, the lack of fellowship that encourages them in this dimension of their lives. We are just growing in our recognition that this is a sphere that we really need to invest in.
Mm-hmm. Well spoken. I wonder if you would just speak finally a little bit to the very practical nuts and bolts of how this happens. Is your community using email? Are you using Skype? How do you actually create this very personal level connection?
The advocacy team regularly calls up via Skype the missionary and establishes a conversation, a relationship, and the spiritual vitality, spiritual formation, spiritual transformation questions become part of that conversation. However, there is no replacing the opportunity for members of the advocacy team, if possible, to visit the missionary and do this investment face to face. And we have found, we have found that when we visit, our missionaries today know we're coming to check and make sure that they're doing okay. We're not coming to check to see if they are doing good work. So we change the nature of the interaction to, hey, we're investing in your own well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, authentically caring and not making it a review of strategic goals.
Exactly.
Another church has suggested to make sure that we clearly separate these conversations from anything about support levels.
Absolutely.
A mission worker may be reluctant to share authentically if they're concerned that the church might cut their support back or be disappointed in some of those ways. But if we can find these ways of really caring, that authentic caring, I don't know how to better describe it, it yields beautiful fruit along this way.
If I may add, a little caveat that we have found out is that when we invest in the missionary on the field, it is often particularly rich when we include the entire team when we go for a visit. And there is something that happens when we recognize that we have to invest in the surrounding plants also, and not just the one that we transplanted that belongs to us. So invest in the community, in the team, and not just in our own missionary.
It's a great vision of how a sending church can help. Very thoughtful stuff. Just before we move on, anything you would want to add about engaging the spiritual journey of a mission worker?
We have to be authentically people being transformed. If we are not experiencing the transformation on our end, we have very little to offer them. This is not academic. This is not knowledge-based. This should be, we are sharing our journey with the Lord and encouraging in their journey with the Lord. We have to be authentic on our end before we head in there.
Very well spoken. Well, there's an example, just the first lesson, engaging in the ongoing spiritual journey of a mission worker. That's lesson 1. Matthew, let's press forward a little now. What's another lesson you've learned about how churches can build healthy relationships with their mission workers?
I think the area that we have started to invest in is investing in the team that's on the field. So not just on our worker, but investing in the team and helping our worker especially better understand how they fit in with the team. Part of the reason for this is we have been seeing that conflicts on the field seem to be a major issue. And it's impossible to deal with that unless we consistently engage with those who are surrounding our missionary.
How are you finding, Matthew, the interaction with team members that may be serving with your mission workers sent from your church? Are others on that team generally receptive to your interactions with them, or are they reluctant?
We have found general receptivity, especially when we know their names, we know the names of their kids. When we visit, we take small gifts for everybody. We have seen an appreciation from their end when they say, wow, this is very kind of you that you're including all of us. And in some of the general times with our missionary, we include them also for times of prayer, times of thinking. And then often with that relationship built, there has been trust that opens up conversations that allow us to step into areas that we would not normally do.
Well, by building a great relationship with your own worker and then seeing like dropping a pebble in a pond, there are going to be rings that expand outward from there that bring good value. I can't imagine it being, harmful in any way. It's just going to be a further setting of a stage for healthy conversations that can take place in the future. Mm. And it demonstrates, I think, generosity on the part of a sending church too, and may provide a good example, a role model, even if a worker, let's say, doesn't have quite the same healthy relationship with their sending church. There may be elements of that they can demonstrate or suggest back to their own sending communities as well.
Absolutely, and we have witnessed that too.
I'll let you go on. Other elements of this, or shall we go on to the next lesson?
Well, let me switch to a third lesson.
Sure.
That we have learned is during the selection process, it's important that we move towards an actual bias towards identifying the specific value add that this mission worker would bring to that team. Mm. Too often, we have seen generalists come through our doors and absolutely convinced the Lord is calling them to a particular place. And some of them have been so persuasive that I've actually risked placing a generalist on the field. And even after 5 years, none of them have turned out to be successful. So we have found that we do an irresponsible job by allowing generalists to go on the field in order to find out what they're going to do. So working with them a little bit longer here in the US or Canada, in figuring out what is the actual value add you're going to do to a particular team in a particular location is worth the time in gold. It's worth the effort. Mm-hmm.
This is striking. As recently as yesterday, we were discussing this very idea that when we have someone applying for service, that we really work to define and articulate what their contribution to that particular team is. And they have a greater sense of context. The church that sends them has a greater sense of awareness and context there. How do you go about this? What's your engagement with the agency or with the team that's there as you explore this?
Well, we usually have about a 2-year on-ramp process because we take a lot of time and energy to make sure that they are ready for the field. So that is kind of something that's unusual about our church. It's not just being an ATM swipe before they go on the field, but actually spending time and helping them discern their sense of calling, discern their spiritual giftedness, discern what the value add is that they're going to contribute, and making sure there is enough evidence here in North America that would indicate that those things are going to thrive on the mission field.
Mm-hmm. And taking that time, like you said, up front, while demands a certain measure of patience, I might say at times. Many are going to be excited to get going, get to the field. Those clear ideas will bear fruit further on. What are some of the ways that you look for these fruits? You said, you want to raise the level of certainty. How does that take place at Trinity or with your partners?
There's a little bit of a practical process in this, and we give a single sheet to all of our missionary candidates, say, this is the sending process. We tell them up front it usually takes 2 years, and we are committed to walking with you over the time. So our missionary candidates have a very clear idea that there are steps, there are benchmarks that will involve conversations with 1 or 2 people as they move through the process of being sent by Trinity. Now, that also puts a little pressure on us to engage relationally with these folk, because certainties come only when there are friendships with these folks, when we know them well. So it's not a yes and no questionnaire type of interaction. It's a sense of life on life with these folks.
Mm-hmm. It implies that they are physically and personally present at Trinity as well.
Absolutely. Or we are willing, and we have engaged with people who are not part of our church, but are, some are in a different state, some are 3-4 hours away, because some of these metrics or methods of engagement are all technical, and we can figure that out.
Yep.
The question is spiritual formation, cross-cultural intelligence, ongoing discipleship, clarity, self-awareness, quite a few categories that we just believe investing in here helps in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, in a moment, we're going to turn our attention to more of these lessons, these first three: engaging the spiritual life of a mission worker, engaging with the team of a mission worker, including their spiritual lives, and number three, helping to clarify during the pre-service preparation the specific role and value-added element that a mission worker will bring to the field, some of the lessons we've discussed. We're going to get on to talk more about developing healthy relationships. Just before we do, we'd like to share a resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Are you looking to expand and improve your church's mission efforts? Catalyst Services is ready to help you out with great resources and excellent training opportunities. Visit catalystservices.org to learn more and sign up for Postings, a monthly e-newsletter with practical advice and tools for churches. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Matthew Phillip. Matthew, let's turn our attention to some of the important relationships that mission workers have while they are on the field. Let's talk about the mission worker's relationship with his or her team, those they're working closely with. How can we help from the local church that sent them?
I think consistently asking questions about the team, getting to know the team, as I've mentioned, is helpful. Providing some resources, whether they're Lencioni's The Five Dysfunctions or Giant Worldwide has an understanding of the five voices. Mm-hmm. What you and I assume as basic understanding appears often as amazingly revelatory stuff to our missionaries when we share it with them. And they recognize how they better can communicate with one another and even listen to one another once they know the particular voice or perspective that their teammates are coming from. And this is a very tender, or it's an area that we have to be very careful on, because we don't want to interfere into an area which classically has belonged to the agency. But these are questions we could pose as, here are some resources, if they would be helpful to you and your team, they're willing to share it. But I think in this delicate dance of having multiple partners, the church has to be careful that we don't enter into areas that classically have remained with the agency.
Sure. What I hear you saying is you're helping them grow in their self-awareness and in their, sometimes we call it EQ, their ability to understand others and relate in healthy ways to others.
Absolutely. And it comes from an observation I've made. This is 10 years of data. In 10 years, I have not yet found a single team that I would give a 10 out of 10 rating for healthy team dynamics.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you'd speak to multicultural teams in this context too. Sometimes we send out workers and they will work all with their own countrymen, or at least like culture. But increasingly, our workers are engaged with others from the majority world, perhaps, or other countries. Any comments on the multicultural teams? I
think it's a trend for the future. And I've seen them in about 10 to 15% of our teams, that multicultural element in play. And we know it's a learning curve as we recognize giftings, as we recognize cultural values that each one's culture brings, as well as recognizing some of the challenges of differing support systems, differing understandings of what we would take as given as understanding of missions. There's a lot of challenge, but there's a richness that comes when we can come to the point of recognizing how do we share the gifts that each one brings. It is also very closely connected to our willingness and commitment to engage with the national church. And I believe that from Trinity, we have the opportunity to encourage monocultural teams to invite others onto their team and to work through the issues that would generate. Even if you're not inviting somebody onto your team, what are the relationships you have with other groups, especially the national church?
Mm-hmm. Let's unpack that a little bit. Why should a local church like Trinity Church, all the way over in North America, be concerned about the workers' relationship with national partners or the national church?
Now, this is a relatively new area for us, and we have found that when national church leaders are present, the dynamic of existence changes. Our missionaries and mission workers have an approach of being, at best, guests in a foreign land. And when you're guests, you recognize the national church as a host. There are the dynamics of respect, of listening, of inclusion, of relationships. But if we come in with the perspective of we're a monocultural group, we're coming in as the saviors to fix, to rescue, to redeem, it is a very self-centered approach that builds into the process a lot of risk. And we have found that our national workers, when they interact with our missionaries, when the interaction is healthy, it's a win-win on both sides. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm not necessarily talking about only Western missionaries and national missionaries. I'm even talking about a particular ethnic group that would go in and assume they do not have relationships with the national church. It happens whether there are Indians who go in and think just the Indians are okay, mm-hmm. or the Koreans who go in and just say we will hang with just the Koreans. It is not a uniquely Western phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Are there particular ways that you have found helpful? What are the means you've used to help develop and sustain, or help your workers develop and sustain a healthy relationship with national partners?
I think the role of the agency is very critical in this, because the agency is usually the entity that has the longest standing part in that particular context. Mm. So we have found engaging the agency in this and finding out who are good partners that they have seen or know or trusted in the long term there, and working with the agencies to figure out who are mutually agreeable national partners that we could engage. And just like we talked about asking specific spiritual journey questions or asking specific questions about the team, I think our scope of inquiry now goes to questions about the national church leaders. How are they doing? So in many ways, we are creating a field cluster that we as a church and Trinity are interested in, that extends far more than just our missionary worker. It extends to his or her team, and it also extends to the national church leadership. So I think we need a little bit more of understanding of reality and not just a simplistic approach of, oh, our missionary is in this city, in this country.
Mm-hmm. You know, it strikes me, this ties back to some of the other things we talked about, the personal visits to the field to encourage and meet with your missionary, mission worker, that this would create opportunity also to be personally relating to teammates, we've talked about that, but also national church leaders or others who are participating in ministry in that region.
Absolutely. And the synergy that happens, the connections that come out of the woodwork, the comparisons of history of similar engagements that either worked well or did not, the richness of a relationship matrix that is expanding, that has more diversity than just people from one particular continent or country. It just makes the entire enterprise of engaging in missions a lot more healthy. Mm-hmm. And from those of us who are managers, it reduces the risk of failure when you have far more relationships going.
Sure. If we can build other healthy supports for all of this, the more the better. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wonder, do you have an example to share with us where you've participated in co-planning or co-evaluation with local ministry leaders?
Well, yes, we just came back actually last week from a kind of an evaluation that we wanted to do in a South American country that we have invested significant dollars over the last 7 years. But instead of us coming in and saying we are going to do an evaluation, we asked the local leader to set up the process. And we said, it's going to be a video documentary, but we want it to be an issue of what has the transformation been. And there will be no reference to our church or no reference to money. And we want this to be a documentary of what God has done among your people so that you can use the documentary locally. That changed the entire dynamic of the willingness of the local people to engage in the conversation. And a leader of this marginalized minority group in this country mentioned to us in passing, but I thought his words were gold. Just asking us our stories of transformation from somebody outside has validated what we are going through and has given us a sense of worth. And the process has created a context for deeper relationships where we respect and honor one another because you guys in North America are listening to us. It was just fascinating when we allowed some of the details of how this is set up to go to our national leaders on this particular situation. Yep.
Wonderful fruit. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that particular example. We are going to continue this conversation with Matthew in the next episode of the Global Mission Podcast. This is a two-parter, as we have mentioned before. But before we sign off, Matthew, we do want to mention here, even in this part one, some of the resources that you have used and appreciated. What would you recommend to missions committees or church leaders by way of resources that are going to be helpful in building healthy relationships with their mission workers?
Let me say a few things quickly. Talk to other mission committees. We are all in a journey of rewriting what good missions from North America is, and I do believe in the wisdom of the good Lord. He's giving different aspects of a new missions movement from North America to different people. And we have to listen to one another to get the gems that he's sharing with his church in North America. So engage with other peers. I do believe we need to engage with the agencies and talk to you guys and say, what are you learning? In missions, how can we be better? There is a temptation in the North American church right now to ignore the agency or to consider them just backroom operators. We need to redeem that relationship and bring it into something of a little bit more of partnering in the gospel of Christ. And the third aspect in this area is ask your global partners how we can be better missionary sending churches, missionary workers. How can we engage better? And if you can allow them to talk, they have a whole lot to tell us about how we're doing and how we can get better. Just more practically, I think catalystservice.org and the regular postings that come out there, the Global Missions Podcast that's here. There are a whole list of books that I find important to us. So I just think being learners, positioned to say, hey, this is a dynamic process and we want to get better every year, will make sure that we are moving in the right direction.
Very good. Well, we will pause there. And for those who would like to join us for the balance of this conversation, we invite you to do that in the next episode. Matthew, thanks for being with us today.
Delighted.
As we mentioned, we will continue this conversation with Matthew in our next episode. By way of preview, that conversation will touch on development of written plans for mission workers, as well as how local churches can build teams to support and care for their mission workers. Remember, you can find the show notes to today's episode at globalmissionspodcast.com, including all the links that were mentioned, and you can connect with us on social media as well through Twitter or Facebook. That's all for now. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. We invite you to join us again next week, not 2 weeks, but next week, for the conclusion of this conversation with Matthew, and we'll continue to explore the grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.